For our final Newsmakers of the year, we're going to take a look back at the year in the news. Our guests today are Julian Leeser, who's the Executive Director of the Menzies Research Institute, and Romilly Madew, who's the CEO of the Green Building Council of Australia. We're going to talk about a lot of things, but I first would just like your reaction to the terrible events of this week with the asylum seeker boat crashing against the rocks in Christmas Island. Romilly Madew.
It's really a tragedy, and a number of people have been, casting blame on different people, including the Navy, and I think really it's time just to sit back, get the facts and deal with the poor people who survived and do the report first before blaming anybody.
Julian Leeser, is this something that needs our attention to the actual incident or a look at the entire asylum seeker policy?
I think it needs both. I mean, it's very sad 30 people died, but I think the policy itself has failed. We've had almost 9,000 people come to Australia by boat since the government was elected. I think you've got Nauru there waiting to use its facilities, to be part of the offshore processing system and act as a real deterrent. You have the TPV regime, which should be brought back. I think these set of deaths were avoidable, and I think the government really does need to review its policy.
So you're saying the government needs to go more hard line. What do you think, Romilly?
I think it's a very complex issue. There are countries dealing with terrible challenges and tragedies that in Australia we can't comprehend. And Australia is a very lucky country, and I think we need to take a broader approach to immigration. This is a tragedy that could have been avoided, and the facts might come out about that. But also, if you look at the percentage of immigrants that we take compared to other countries, it's still quite low. I think, Australia is a very lucky country, and we should open our arms to some of these people.
I'm not sure that's right. I think per capita we are the second largest destination, we're the country that takes the second largest number of refugees after Canada. So this is not about whether you're generous or not. It's about the process and how you bring people to Australia. And there are people waiting in camps all over the world, in Chad, in Pakistan and so on. We should give them priority.
It's certainly a huge problem for a lot of particularly developed nations in the world. Let's segue into our first discussion point on politics. It was a pretty momentous year in that the sitting Prime Minister was dumped, a state backlash against Labor. I wonder, Julian Leeser, we've also had a poll out this morning saying that the opposition is just ahead of Labor in opinion polls. What does this say of the year, do you think?
I think people are dissatisfied with the outcome of the independence decision with relation to the election result, and I think you've seen, with the exception of about one or two polls since that time, people have tended to favour the opposition.
But the opposition did not win the election outright, did it?
No, but...
And that's a failing, isn't it?
But there was a major swing against the government, the largest swing against a first-term government since the 1930s. So I think it's really a big question for the government. Of course, the opposition can do better. Tony Abbott's announced through the Menzies Research Centre he's going to be revisiting a range of policy issues over the next year. But, look, I think it's been a pretty bad year for the Labor Party.
But it seems to me, though, it's a bad year for all parties, apart from the Greens, who seem to have gone well. For all parties at both the state and the federal level, it's quite interesting. It's like the electorate have had backlash against all of them. The fact that so much focus is on politics rather than on actual issues that people want to face. The fact that we still have issues around healthcare, education, infrastructure. It seems to be that the electorate is just annoyed, irrespective of which political party, they're annoyed, and they're making it known. If you look at some of our state election, especially in Victoria and Tasmania, it's so close.
Victoria is a good example. I mean, no one predicted that the Liberal Party would win. People were predicting the Greens were going to pick up seats, and you've got the Liberal Party controlling the upper house there, which was completely unexpected. So.
But I want to look at the two major parties, because obviously that's where politics is still focused. What have they done wrong? Let's look at the Liberals first. Why didn't they garner more support in the election?
It really, I think, for both of them actually, including the Liberals, comes down to bold leadership. Everyone couldn't really distinguish between the two parties, which was coming out in a number of the different articles and media around the two parties. People that pick up the paper to decide which government they're going to vote for, in some cases were like, what's the major difference here? And then the parties didn't articulate the difference clearly. And at the same time, and this has happened in the UK and the US, Where's the bold leadership? Where's the strong party?
Is there bold leadership coming from Julia Gillard?
I think she's had a tough year trying to demonstrate bold leadership. There were 3 problems she said she'd fix. She was going to try and fix the mining tax. That's front page news again today. She was going to try and fix climate change. We still have this sort of series of different committees. And she was going to try and fix the asylum seeker issue, and we've of course had the tragedy in the last few days.
Well, that's not related to anything Julia Gillard's done.
It's related
that was
to
an
the
accident.
policy. It's related to the fact that she hasn't managed to get up the East Timor processing centre. The East Timorese don't seem to want it, and
well, that's
there is an
too.
alternative. There is an alternative policy there which she could take hold of, and she's chosen not to.
Now, you mentioned climate change there. One thing I'd love to discuss. We've had a lot of natural disasters. We have disasters every year. This year there was an earthquake in Haiti, volcanoes have erupted. We have them every year, but Romilly, Madew, is there a theme to the natural disasters we're seeing and, of course, the big debate around climate change?
Well, scientists would say that there is a theme and that climate change is showing itself more and more in these severe weather systems that we're getting. What it does show, though, is that we need to adapt and mitigate against climate change better, especially on our coasts, an area where we know that severe weather issues are going to be occurring, and the two don't seem to be happening. So the number of climate change severe weather patterns are increasing, but we don't seem to be then adapting as a country to the housing that we're building, the infrastructure that we're putting in. One of the biggest things we really need to do, not just in Australia but overseas, in Haiti and other countries, is build it back green. And when there's been earthquakes in China and Italy, for instance, it was the old buildings that survived, not the new buildings. So it's really crucial that these infrastructure that we build when we have these severe weather conditions can cope with what's happening and going to happen in the future.
Julian, Leeser, do you feel that the heat has gone out of the whole climate change impetus? It feels like about 18 months ago, perhaps it was much more top of people's minds.
I think you've put it well, Jane. I think the heat has gone out of it. I'm pleased to hear Romilly talking about adaptation. I actually think that's where we've always needed to go with this debate, looking at the situation as it presents itself in Australia. How can we build better? What crops should we plant where we plant them? I think the likelihood of getting a price on carbon is quite low. It seems much more distant now than at any time in the past.
Do you agree with that, Romilly?
International pressure would show that maybe it's not the case, and I probably do disagree with you, Julian, especially because COP16 seemed to be a lot better than what came out of Copenhagen. It would, and if you look at what the Minister Combet said yesterday about considering a different form of an ETS, which is something that the Greens have been talking about. Also, if you look at the fact that industry and like major businesses that weren't 2 years ago are much more open about talking about a price on carbon, would indicate that the likely chances it could come through.
But you have a big disagreement between the Greens and the Labor Party as to what should the cut be. Should it be 5%, which the Labor Party wants? Should it be 40%? Do we have a carbon tax? Do we have an ETS?
The Greens are much more in line now than they were 2 years ago.
Well, they've talked about 40% in the last couple of weeks. I mean, it's a long way between 5 and 40%, and the two have very radically different effects on the economy.
There was some media and information that came out yesterday from the Greens that was saying that they are very pleased with Combet's announcement, which would indicate that there's much more alignment. But just picking up a point you made, Julian, one thing, you were saying that you felt that the heat had gone out of climate change, and I think that probably has happened. We've had a very challenging year in politics. Something that's interesting that's happened this week in New South Wales is the issue around the electricity sale of the electricity, and they keep talking about the increased price of electricity. I'm like, you're missing the main issue here. If you build the homes properly and you build the offices properly and you put in energy efficiency,
you're going
to alleviate some of the issue, and there's too much data to show that. And it's really interesting that there's this big focus on the price of electricity, whereas we can mitigate against that.
One of the reasons for the increase in the price is because IPART, which is the tribunal here in New South Wales which helps set prices, thought that we were going to see a change in carbon pricing, and so they factored in quite a large increase. We're unlikely to see that change. I think people deserve a bit of relief from that pricing. Let's
talk about hot air of a different kind. And we had the Quran-burning pastor Terry Smith, who's just been refused a visa to the UK, incidentally. Was this a story, an example of a non-story in a way? This was one man sprouting off about something, but it could have caused a huge global reaction.
You could be cynical to say it was a slow media day when that came out.
Is that ever possible, Romilly?
Exactly. But for that issue, it was amazing that he got the attention. If he hadn't have got the attention, none of this might have come out, but he it then built momentum, and then YouTube and people were sharing it, but none of us would have known about it unless the media had showcased us that it was happening in the first place.
But it seems to be the case with a lot of things that way, that's how they get to prominence. It's on YouTube or somebody mentions it. In fact, you could argue that Osama bin Laden wouldn't get his message out if it wasn't for social media and the modern age, couldn't you?
I think this whole issue really is a demonstration that we are so much more interconnected now than ever before, that a pastor could be protesting in Florida about a development that was happening in New York, and that it caused repercussions around the world such that you had the leading general in Iraq coming out and saying, look, please don't do this because it'll have effects on our troops. It really does show what an interconnected world we live in.
Now, I was going to talk quickly about the austerity measures in the UK, but I actually want to move on to the Julian Assange question, because I think it's dominated the news in the past few weeks. We now have Jeffrey Robertson to the rescue. Why are governments so keen to prosecute this man?
Well, I think that there are good reasons that he should be prosecuted. Some of the information that's come out is potentially damaging. We've heard stories this morning about the effect it's having on politics in Zimbabwe. We've heard David Kilcullen, who's a senior Australian defence strategist, talk about the difficulties it might have in Afghanistan in terms of Taliban leadership there, naming 1,200 people that have been mentioned in these cables that they want to try and attack. You don't know the ramifications of some of this material and how it will move on, and I think it sets a bad precedent. National security is important. Governments and diplomats and governments need to be able to talk to each other with some confidence, and I think this undermines that system. That's why it's such a worry.
But he's also been able to showcase things that tried to be hidden. I think one of the things he has shown, and there does need to be balance in what WikiLeaks is doing, but what he has shown is the need for transparency, and that government and mostly government and politics can't say one thing, but then something else appears through WikiLeaks which shows that they were completely saying the opposite. They need to be very transparent about what they're saying, because they're now going to be, it can be captured. But the filming of the journalist, I think, that was shot, is showing that you can't lie about what you're doing because of what you're saying now about the whole change in IT.
It does mean that everything is open and will eventually be published. But look, we are going to have to leave it there. Romilly, Madew, Julian, Leeser, thanks so much for joining us on Newsmakers, and we look forward to seeing you next year.
Thank you.
Thanks very much.